This is Dr Gemma Ahearne, University Teacher in Criminology at the University of Liverpool, and you are listening to the Academy's Developing Practice podcast.
Hello, in this episode, we met with Dr Gemma Ahearne, a university teacher in criminology based in the School of Law and Social Justice. We chat with her about her module development and her use of micro-learning to support inclusion. We hope you enjoy.
Hi Gemma, we're really pleased to be speaking with you today, and we're delighted to speak to you about your module development and the use of micro-learning to support inclusion. But before we get started, and we like to do this with every guest that we have on the podcast, can you give us a little bit about your background and how you arrived at the position that you're in today?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on today. I've had quite an unusual trajectory into higher education. I came to the University of Liverpool when I was 18 and I dropped out for a number of health-based reasons and also bereavement. So I've done a lot of work in different industries, including the nighttime economy, hair and beauty industry, charity work in the third sector, hospitality. At 25, I came back into higher education, did my undergraduate degree. I then got offered the opportunity to do a fully funded PhD. I got a scholarship at Leeds Beckett University, and then it's gone on from there, really. I taught at the same time as doing that at two different universities. And I think that's what's given me such a keen interest in what we're going to talk about today.
Wow, so you've worked in and around most parts of Liverpool by the sounds of it.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely had quite a varied career.
Brilliant. And tell us a bit about your role now, Gemma, at the university.
So I'm a university teacher in criminology and sociology in the School of Law and Social Justice. I lead on 5 modules across all levels of the programme, including 2 that I developed myself and 1 that I redeveloped that belonged to a staff member who left. So I think that gives me a really good overview of the degree programmes and how all the modules fit together. It also means that my role is, T&S. I'm focused on teaching and scholarship, and that again really gives me a firm interest in this area of developing.
Fantastic. And as a result of that work that you've been doing, you've recently been awarded a Learning, Teaching and Student Experience Award. So many congratulations for that. The award's based on your work that you've been doing at that kind of module level in the School of Law and Social Justice. So I wondered if you could start by just telling us a bit about how you've developed that module and the content within it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a real honour to win that award, and I think particularly during, these uncertain times of the pandemic, it was great that the students engaged so well with it. The module is SOCI 349, Crime, Justice and the Sex Industry. And it's really a culmination of nearly 20 years experience that I've got in this area of the sex industry. And it's a way for students to investigate the socio-historical context of the sex industry, law, policy, but also bringing together things like media portrayals, lived experience of sex workers, because that's something I'm really passionate about. I believe that knowledge comes from many different places. It's formed in many different ways. And I think often, people can speak over or for marginalised groups. And I very much think that we should work with people and let people speak for themselves. So the module is split into 12 weeks, and it's all given to the students as a package at the beginning of the semester. That's when I started developing my micro-learning pedagogy. It was before I was diagnosed with dyslexia. So I've only been diagnosed with dyslexia since October 2020. But obviously, without knowing that, I was already working in this way. And it means that students get to see overall what they're doing. If people go on my blog, I've put the link for you to put with this podcast. I use a visual navigation grid, and that gives a very clear visual shortcut to what we're covering over those 12 weeks. And it means that students can access the module at any point that they want. And when I did my Alistair Pilkington Award presentation video, I explained it as like a board game or a computer game, and there's different pieces of the board moving around in different directions. And what that means is that firstly, students have control over the pace of their learning. That's very important in normal times, but particularly during the pandemic, when students might have, digital inequalities in terms of Wi-Fi access, in terms of not having their own computer, in terms of, their paid work or caring commitments they've had to take on. Also, new patterns in student behaviour that I've been aware of from, my own experience, but also researching this, is a lot of students like people binge watch Netflix or the television. They kind of binge studying. So they might book a day where they go to the library and they want to complete, their lectures for that week, and then they split their other days up. So it gives students control in terms of the direction of the learning, but also the pace and the speed of how they are going through the module. And the micro learning as well means that instead of me trying to replicate an hour lecture that I would do face to face, but do it online, which I don't think would work, I've broken each lecture for each week down into 3 or 4 chunks, which guide the students through a series of small tasks, but it means that they get a sense of achievement and attainment for each of those small units, which again means if they don't have good Wi-Fi, if they're having to rest because of health issues, if they're having to balance a variety of commitments, it again gives them a sense of control and attainment as they're going through, so they don't feel like, they're not keeping up or they're missing out and things like that.
From what you're describing and what I saw at the Alistair Pilkington Award presentation, the students can choose the order of their learning for the module. And there's also, if potentially they find an aspect of the module too distressing, they can leave that out. Is that right?
Yeah, so I had 2 things published recently with Times Higher Education, and one was about the microlearning and having dyslexia myself. But the second article was about trauma-informed learning. So I recognise that, a lot of the things that I teach and research can be very emotive. They're about gender, violence, sex industry, and so on. So the way my module is designed is that after week 1, which looks at the an introduction to the module and the history of sex work, and after week 2, which looks at the law and policy, after that, students can dive in at whatever point they want. I do weekly seminars, so that does go in chronological order. However, for example, week 5 is on stigma and violence. If students find any of those chunks of the lecture, those microlearning chunks, distressing or triggering or traumatic, they can miss that chunk. I give very clear trigger warnings and I give very clear instructions about what I'm going to talk about. And I've made the learning outcomes for the module dependent on the students, their overall learning. So if they miss that particular segment, that's okay. They can still, pass the module with flying colours. They can still meet the learning outcomes. I think it's really important, particularly because the students have been at home. So you're missing a lot of those, those cues you get when you're face to face with someone, and you can read someone's body language, or you can see if someone is distressed or just uncomfortable. I think it's been really important for me to recognise that and really push forward with my trauma-informed learning.
So these are criminology students or wider sociology students, or which students are these?
So most of the students are criminology, sociology and social policy, but there's also, some combined honours students with law and other programmes. Just to give you a taste of numbers, for the coming year, I've got 82 students registered, but 71 on the waiting list at the moment. So it's a very popular module because it cuts across strands of different disciplines. So there's different students wanting to go into different careers that will really get the benefit from this module.
Fantastic. And that's something I was going to ask you about, because I guess you're looking at quite a unique case study here in terms of the sex industry and sex work. But I guess the module supports students with their wider sociological understanding as well.
Absolutely. So we're talking about things like, the feminisation of poverty, which is obviously a driving force for people to be in the sex industry in the first place. When we talk about stigma and violence, we also talk about wider rape culture and the patriarchy and wider violences against women that we situate the particular violence against sex workers within. When we talk about trafficking and migrant sex workers, again, we talk about, exploitation of labour in different industries across society. So a lot of the things that we talk about are transferable to other modules. And I think a lot of the study skills that I embed within the module, again, are transferable across most other modules, if not every other module the students are going to be learning on.
Brilliant. And what's the feedback of the students been?
It's been amazing. My student evaluations took my breath away. Obviously, I really hoped that they would engage with it and enjoy it and appreciate it. But they loved it. They loved the fact that everything had been provided at the beginning of the semester because it took a lot of anxiety away from them. They liked the fact that they could choose the order. And when I'm talking about choosing the order, I do a weekly seminar that does go in chronological order. But what it means is that if, for example, the example I gave before of week 5, stigma and violence, I do expect the students to have completed the lecture chunks and done the mini tasks. But some of them have then jumped ahead and they thought, well, I really like week 11 about the sex worker globally, the sex worker rights movement and the policing of it. And so they've done reading associated with that, but fed that into the seminar for week 5. So it's meant we've had a real richness and breadth of information, journal articles, reports, policy documents being brought into the debate for that week, which just is brilliant because it means that students are getting so much extra information from that peer-led learning.
Gemma, it's really interesting, this. And I find it really interesting that you allow students to skip bits that might trigger various emotional states. I think that's really thoughtful. Can I ask what sort of support is in place for some students for the topic that they are learning about? So what support is in place for them, particularly for those who might actually be in the sex industry? And I asked that question because I saw some guidance. I think it was the University of Leicester had put out, and there was a bit of a backlash against it. So I was just wondering what support do the students have here?
Thanks so much for asking that because it's really important. The University of Leicester have been amazing in their pioneering work about student sex worker strategy and the toolkit. And I sit on that national coordination board for that, although I wasn't involved in the University of Leicester project, but I work with everybody involved. It's a difficult situation because we can't be seen to be promoting sex work. So I can't be seen to be promoting prostitution, let's say, if, someone wanted to frame it that way or the right-wing press wanted to pick up on that and, it wouldn't look very good for the university. However, I am aware that no matter what people think about the sex industry and, people have a right to their feelings about it, there will be students at the university who are involved in the sex industry because when I was at university, I was a dancer and I talk about that openly. I publish on that. I've got lots of articles and chapters next year coming out about that and about how that gives me a very particular strategy to my learning. So I tell the students, I signpost them to the relevant support we've got in the university. But I do also share the student sex work toolkit in week 1 of the module. So that's there uploaded on Canvas. And we also in week 1 talk about the ground rules for our learning. So I run all the seminars for my module. So I had 103 students this year and I ran all of the seminars, which was what I wanted, but it meant I got to meet all of the students. And we came up with ground rules such as everyone is entitled, of course, to their opinion. And their opinion might be based on, cultural factors, religious factors, their own lived experience, traumas, and that is perfectly okay for people to have a particular ideological stance on sex work. That is fine. But we must understand that other people in the room, whether that is the Zoom classroom, whether that is going to be the face-to-face classroom going on further, has their own experiences or their family and friends do. And we've got to think about the language we use, that it's respectful. And we've also got to make sure in our assessed work that what we say isn't just our opinion. It has got to be backed up with academic literature, policy documents, reports, and so on. So because of that, students do feel supported, and I make them aware of the national guidance on this, of how we should support student sex workers, and that toolkit that's available. But I mean, going forward, my dream, if I was a permanent member of staff, would be to try and pursue a student sex work strategy. The University of Leicester have done amazing work, and I've got no doubt it might sound dramatic, it's life-saving work, because sex workers are so marginalised and socially excluded, and that means that when they suffer violence, they might not feel able to go to the police. For example, if they suffer violence at the hands of a partner, they feel that their sex working status is going to be used against them. It means they're at increased risk of feeling really isolated, and obviously, particularly during a pandemic, that leads to increased risk of mental health issues, and so on. So yeah, my dream with that would be that we would have a student sex work strategy, and that people would recognise that isn't about us promoting anything. The same way that we've got colleagues here who are doing amazing work in harm reduction with drugs. And again, that doesn't mean we're promoting go and take drugs, but if people are going to take drugs, they're going to do it as safely as possible, and understand what they're doing.
Let's just talk about the module itself. So yeah. You've redesigned the module, and you've utilised a micro-learning approach. So this micro-learning's really big across learning and development and higher education, but I think it's less used in higher education at the moment. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and why you looked at that approach?
Yeah, I think from last March, really, when the pandemic emerged, and when I started to think, how is university going to look like in September? And I had no idea, but I made a plan A and a plan B, because this was a new module. This only launched in September. So I designed it in 2 ways, a face-to-face way and an online digital way. And I just thought, looking at all the different literature I drew on from around the country, I'm also a member of the Sex Work Research Hub. So that's a group of like 280 core academics globally who are researching the sex industry. So I compared my module that I was designing with 10 other modules that run on the sex industry at a range of institutions. And I really talked about what I was doing with friends and colleagues around the country and around the globe in some cases. And I just thought that microlearning was going to work best in terms of breaking down some complex ideas, and also bearing in mind that for many students, this is going to be the first time they've studied anything to do with the sex industry, but perhaps for some other students that isn't the case. So it's understanding that people are coming in perhaps with different range of information or background already, and it's guiding them through. So the way that I've recorded the lecture chunks, it's almost as if I'm there with the students, literally guiding them through mini tasks. And one of the funniest things that students have said this year, which makes me laugh, is they've obviously done all these mini tasks, and they've also done a lot of reading. But they've said, you've made us do more reading than anyone else ever has, but you've tricked us into it. We didn't realise we were doing that much work. But they've all said that everything is so interesting and all the reading is digitally provided for them. They've said that they just couldn't stop reading, and they've done more reading than they've ever done because they've wanted to. But that just makes me laugh, that the thought that I've kind of sneakily made students do more reading than perhaps they realised they were going to do. But they've said they've wanted to, just because they found it such an interesting topic.
Yeah, and you've clearly used chunking to make them go from one bit of the topic to the next.
Yeah.
And so without them realising, they've actually taken in a lot of content.
Yeah, basically.
And what was your motivation for doing that? Obviously, you've touched on being diagnosed dyslexic in October 2020. Did that have some influence on that?
I think definitely, because when I was designing the module, I didn't know I was dyslexic. I hadn't been diagnosed, but I was aware that I was a very visual, creative thinker. That's how I learn, and that's how I teach. So I was trying to think, if this module is online, because obviously we didn't know what was going to happen, how is it going to best cater for EDI issues? And for me, thinking about, the different learning difficulties people might have, different disabilities and health conditions people are living with, as I said earlier, different caring responsibilities, but also the different digital inequalities people might have. To me, from all the literature that I was reading and all the conversations I was having with colleagues all around the country when I was designing this module, it seemed like the best way forward, and it seemed to be the strongest learning position to take, was to do it in this way.
Brilliant. And can you tell us a bit about how you've then gone on to assess the module? So with the micro-learning and the chunking of the curriculum, how have you then assessed that at the end?
So the module has one assessment at the end, which is a 2,500 word essay. And the essay questions are provided at the beginning of the module, at the beginning of the semester, with everything else. So students know what those essay questions are going to be. And there's an essay question that correlates to each week's learning. What that meant was that a lot of students from the beginning of the semester had already narrowed it down to maybe 2 or 3 essay questions that they thought they were going to be particularly interested in. And it also meant, for example, if they wanted to look at the essay question that correlates to week 11, which was the global sex worker rights movement and the policing of sex work, then all the way through the module, they could be thinking about how they were going to be answering that question. So they weren't going to be at a detriment because they chose the question that related to the week 11 content all the way through. When we're talking about the law in week 2, when we're talking about stigma and violence in week 5, when we're talking about the contested spaces of sex work in week 8, and how community groups can have a big impact on how sex work is understood and policed, all the way through. They can be pulling those strands into how they're going to answer their question. And that meant that the external examiner picked up on this as well, that it was quite clear the students had engaged with the module as a whole. And that's what I really wanted. I didn't want them to just be able to pick a certain question and come to a certain week and that be that. I really wanted them to have a really holistic understanding. So other things were that no matter what week's question they picked, I wanted them to show an awareness of the history of sex work, the law and policy. I also wanted them, if they could, to try and get sex workers' voices in there, whether that be, an event that they've attended online, because I signposted all the way through as well to lots of different events that were available by Zoom, free for the students to attend, and global events, whether that be a blog post they've read by a sex worker, whether that's a certain campaign that they've seen reported on, but I wanted them to get all these different strands in their answer. And that, again, you know, I don't like it to sound surveillance culture, and I'm a criminologist, so, you know, I shouldn't really be thinking about the panopticon, but when you look at Canvas, at how many hours the students spent engaged with the module, students were often spending hundreds of hours. And that wasn't because they had to. They could have spent much less if they wanted to, but it's because they wanted to. And I think many students also reported back through the student evaluations and also, you know, by email at the end of the module, that they'd never wanted to read so much, but it's also made them want to read more on other modules as well. It's given them the confidence to break down policy documents, to think more about the law, to think more about how you can access information in different places, whether that's academic books, journal articles, reports, blogs, podcasts, different online conferences and events. It's given them that confidence to bring all that knowledge together. So that's made me very happy as well, to think that that's a transferable skill that they're going to take to different modules.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess when on paper, when you talk about micro-learning and chunking the curriculum, as an academic, you're concerned that students then aren't able to join up the dots. But obviously from the way you're talking, there's a real clear scaffolding of learning as they move through the module.
Absolutely. And I also use this approach for SOCI 256, which is a module I took over at a month's notice from a colleague who left the university. So I couldn't, you know, redesign that module. It was there, but I brought it up to date. I put more of my kind of examples in, and I re-recorded all the modules using this micro-learning strategy. And again, the student feedback on the evaluations for that module were also absolutely excellent. Their attainment and their engagement was excellent. So they definitely joined up the dots there as well. I've also used this micro-learning pedagogy in my core module that I lead, SOCI 103, which has just shy of 240 students on it. And that covers 4 weeks on race, 4 weeks on class, and then 4 weeks on gender. So, you know, a colleague does the 4 weeks on race, another colleague does the class block, and then I do the gender block. And again, obviously we haven't had the assessments in yet, but from what I've seen from the seminar and from what I've been getting from the feedback coming through from students, and again, from what I can see from the engagement hours on Canvas, it's worked really well. And I think you're right, Alex, that often this concern around, you know, is this robust? Does this represent like a de-skilling or a dumbing down in higher education? And I would argue, absolutely no, it doesn't. It makes students do more because they want to do more. It enthuses them to do more. And the way it's scaffolded, it makes students feel more supported because it guides them through a series of mini tasks, which then leads on to the reading. So by the time they come to the seminar class, they've already done a range of things and they're so prepared. So our seminar classes were just so rich. The debates we were having often were of a master's level, not a third year level. And some of the work I marked, it was like of a master's level, not a third year module. And again, that was something the external examiner picked up on, the sheer standard of the essays, which were absolutely outstanding.
It's really great that you've managed to transfer the format into other modules. So have you got colleagues in the department who are picking up on this as well? I mean, will you be able to sort of enable other people to use this model going forward?
I think definitely, yeah. And I'm also speaking to colleagues around the country about what I'm doing. When I was in Times Higher Education doing those 2 articles that I mentioned earlier, that got a lot of attention. And a lot of people have wanted Zoom meetings with me and have wanted to know what I'm doing, including colleagues in Australia, New Zealand and America, wanting to know how it works in practice. You know, they thought it sounds good, but how is it going to work? So they wanted some concrete examples I could give them, perhaps to reassure them that it will work. And yeah, I've been speaking to colleagues all around the country as well. There's quite a core group of us that have been sharing resources throughout the pandemic, particularly colleagues who, like myself, are on a TNS trajectory and who are very ambitious about that. We've been sharing, you know, experiences, resources, and really supporting each other. So this is definitely something that can be transferred across modules, across programs, and across universities. And I like the thought of, you know, the University of Liverpool could be really pioneering in this. And I like the idea of that. I think we should be at the forefront of teaching and learning, just as we are at the forefront of, you know, excellent research that has been done by colleagues across the university. I think the same could be said for teaching. And, you know, I would like to see that happen.
Brilliant. I mean, it's great that you're managing to reach so many colleagues, you know, around the world with this. You best get your consultancy agreements in place so you can, you know, start to really take advantage.
Yeah, I think I'm giving away too many freebies, Matthew, and I think you're right. I need to think about this. But it's just been so great to, you know, obviously the pandemic is awful and I don't want to downplay that. But in terms of opportunities, it's also brought a lot of teaching staff together globally. And I think that has really strengthened what I'm doing individually, but what we are doing as programs, what we can do as universities, because, you know, I'm speaking to people I would never have spoken to before the pandemic because I didn't used to use Zoom and Teams, and they just weren't things, you know, I'm a very teaching heavy member of staff, so that just wasn't something I'd have been involved in. Whereas now that is the norm, and it has opened up a lot of avenues to see what other people are doing and see how we can advance each other's teaching and learning strategies.
Gemma, one of the things that really comes across in your conversation is your passion for teaching and for students. Would you say that that's really important to you as a university teacher?
Absolutely. That is the most important thing for me. You know, the student experience, student engagement, helping the students develop and learn. That's what I'm passionate about. And I would like to see more value placed on teaching and developing different practice, and that it isn't seen as a second-class citizen perhaps to award-winning research. Research is so important, particularly at our university, but so is teaching and learning. So I definitely would like to promote more, you know, TNS trajectories and people who really value working in this area.
Wonderful, thank you. And it seems you've written some really interesting articles on this and on other related topics, which we'll definitely link to in the podcast reading list. Well, Gemma, this podcast is called the Developing Practice Podcast, and we love to finish each conversation with 3 or 4 take-home tips from our guest. So in terms of you reflecting on your own personal practice, do you have 3 or 4 tips that you could share with us so that we could reflect on them too?
Yeah, I think firstly, don't be scared of trying new things. It's good to be trying new things. You can reflect on them. You know, if things don't work out, you can change it. You can be adaptable. I think second, reach out to other colleagues, whether that's at your institution, nationally, internationally, and learn from what other people are doing. I think that's really important to be part of that movement. And I think third, really place value on teaching. And, you know, I get really excited about teaching, and I think that comes across to the students, and I think they bounce off that passion and enthusiasm.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gemma. It's been fantastic chatting to you. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma.
Thank you.
was wonderful to catch up with Gemma and hear about the things that she's been doing with her module design. In fact, it's been great to have a lot of these conversations with lots of people who are doing really interesting things. As an OD advisor, I often don't get the chance to hear about all of these things that are being done to enhance the teaching. So yeah, Gemma was another one, and she was reflecting on the really, really positive student feedback that she'd had in regard to her creativity around her module design. The students seemed to really appreciate how Gemma had worked really hard to design that module and to suit the needs of the learners while still ensuring they were able to satisfy the learning outcomes of the module.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great that Gemma's been recognised with the Learning, Teaching and Student Experience Award as a result. I like the way she described her micro-learning pedagogy, and that had come from her own reflections on her experience of learning with dyslexia. I really like the way she was describing that students on her module can learn in small, manageable chunks that suits their pace of learning, their learning preferences, any digital inequalities, and their specific life experience. So she's obviously really thought about the way she wanted to design her module. Well, there's lots for us to think about there. If you'd like to take your thinking further, we've added some resources to the website on a specific podcast reading list, which you can access at liverpool.ac.uk/the-academy/podcast. You can also let us know what you thought about the episode. You can tweet us at Live Uni Academy, and you can also find us at eLearnerMatt or at Alexandra_Owen on Twitter.
And we're really grateful for those who have taken the time to either rate or review our show in your podcast provider's app. So if you are an Apple user, please do take the time to review our show, as it really will help others find us. Bye for now.